For me, the revisioning derives from a French word meaning to look again, the re in the word. So there's a kind of taking a second look at what we imagine to be the case. And for my understanding, the history of consciousness has been sort of laden with a very modernist Enlightenment era narrative of progress. Graeber and Wengrow's work looks at, the movement from bands to tribes to agriculture in early states is largely a false one. There's a lot more complexity and thousands of years of variation and alternation back and forth between what we imagine to be stages of human social organization. So that's sort of the basis there. But I think the principle for me of why we need to revise history is that, again, if we have a much more rhizomatic view of time and experience of time is relational, then history is much more relational than we imagine it to be. The constellations of meaning that we make out of our own stories change what's possible not only in the present but also for the future. If we are going with a kind of simplified teleology that history had to have happened according to these stages and we simply are where we are because we need to be, because it's the best of all possible trajectories, etc., it forecloses different possibilities. If we see history rather as a kind of experimental space of variation, of human innovation and social plasticity, we ourselves feel much more capable of reimagining the world, especially right now when it's needed. So there's a sort of ethical imperative, I think, in revisioning history, in that it's a different story about who we are, where we've come from, and where we might be going. It's a worldview, a fundamental worldview inquiry. A different story about how we got to where we are radically changes what we have imagined to be possible in the future. History is a rhizome. So what constellations of the past, what significant dates, quote unquote, of the historical past can be reconstellated to imagine different futures? And then also, what about the past was successful that needs to be brought forward in a living way with the present? I think, again, if you're looking at traditional ecological knowledge, tech, if you're looking at indigenous forms of complexity that Tyson Yunkaporta talks about, those forms of knowing and being in the world are not some earlier successive stage. They very much look like something that's going to be an integral component of the future and the survival of our species and perhaps thriving. So for me, this sort of nonlinear dance with history is what it's really all about. How do we truly live an integral life? How do we really radically live this and embody it? It would be a very radical new relationship with time and economy. What would an economic world be that was in adherence to bioregionalism and Gaian systems? That would look very, very different from what we have today, which is completely out of relationship with it. But also, the colonization of time by capital would be the sort of fundamental usurpation that I think the integral age would challenge us. It does challenge us with. How do we live in a different relationship with time, where time doesn't mean money, but time means soul. Time means temps, like in the French word weather. It means both weather and time. How do we reintroduce the qualitative back into time, or discover the qualitative in time? And what would we do differently? I think we would certainly not organize our entire society around the productions of capital and speculative markets. We have this sort of bioregional turn towards localization, but I think also the democratization of labor in our economies that become much more localized. And I don't mean small in the sense of like simplifying. They could still be very complex. But what we see at Mondragon is a good example in Spain of different ways of doing things. We need a lot more experimentation. If our industrial capitalist civilization, if globalization has failed and is failing, we need constructive alternatives, and we need places where we're already experimenting with different lived futures. We can't merely talk about it, but we have to begin to find ways to make it a very material, substantive alternative. Le Guin has this line about, to oppose something, you empower that thing. You have to actually walk a different road. You have to walk away from it. So I'm very interested in ways in which we can walk away from the now failing dream of globalization. The future is not if we're going to have a future, it can't be with the economy that we have today. And I'm not calling myself a Marxist or something, but I think those kinds of questions are profoundly at the core of what it means to transform our world. To transform our economy requires us to have a different relationship with time and a different relationship with the agency of the more than human. There has to be something else. And I would borrow maybe from Teilhard de Chardin, the word planetization is a good exchange of words here, moving away from globalization and thinking more about this in terms of planetization and what that means for our economies, what that means for how we organize ourselves, and imagining a world that's beyond industrial civilization. We need to be practicing economic and social and ecological relations in a fundamentally different way, and in a way that's not just an extreme alternative that not many people will be able to adapt or learn from. So there's a sort of pedagogical element that I'm inquiring into right now too. How does this become accessible? How does it become teachable and available to more and more people? There's already a way in which the future is living us as this felt sense or background experience. I'm very interested in ways we can touch on that background experience as a kind of new universality, a sort of negative universality, but I think that's very good. To have a negative universality in the sense of the planetary imaginary being very friendly with epistemic humility. To me, there's a very fecund ground there for beginning to imagine and think about ways of connecting with people about what's not working anymore, and then what might emerge as an alternative way of literally feeding and getting energy and raising the next generation and making sure our water is clean. Where there are thematically forms of emergence, whether we're talking about different relationships with time, relocalization, regeneration, where you see that happening, gravitate towards it, because it needs new minds and creative innovation. So whether we're talking about regenerative communities, different forms of governance, economics, different ways of thinking and perceiving, or simply just being an artist in this time and sensing into what's alive, we need folks doing that. We need folks creating constructively alternative futures, and I think everybody's welcome. There's a kind of terrestrial homecoming. There's a sort of a Gaian homecoming in that we need folks that are working on the gardens, and we need the brilliant engineers that are thinking ecologically, but also trying to bring the innovations of modernity into allyship with this regenerative turn. We need folks like that more than ever. So I would say the future is present, and we ought to be experimenting with how we can live it. I think simply saying yes to that is a radical position to have, particularly in a time where everything feels like it's falling apart. But exactly where everything is falling apart is where we begin to see the future taking root, because now there's ground for it. Now there's actually a gap or a fissure where something new can open up in us.